Hello, this is Seth Parnell, the minister at the Portia Church of Christ, and this is episode 206 of the Midweek Bible Study. Hope that you are doing well. Hope things are going your way. Appreciate you being here with us tonight. It's been a beautiful day outside. It's starting to get a little chilly in the mornings. Like if you go out early in the morning, you'll know sometimes you'll need a jacket. Sometimes it'll be a little cool. Some of you might like the cold weather. You might like it getting cool, and so that's kind of your thing. And so more power to you if that's the case. But we're starting to head into fall, and so the temperatures are going to start dropping a little, but it should be all right. Should be okay. And so then we got October, where we just finished off September, and now we're going through October. And then, of course, after October, we have the holiday season, Thanksgiving and Christmas. And so this year is almost done. We've got only 3 months left in this year. That is crazy to me, to think about how far and how fast this year has flown. And so it's been a good one, I think, but it's a definitely, we're coming up on the last section of this year. So hopefully it's been a good one for you as well. Well, as we always do, we want to give you an invitation. If you're someone who is in the Portia area, come by and see us. We would love to see you. We are located at 307 South Jackson Street in Portia, Arkansas. Right now, we are meeting at 10 o'clock and 11 o'clock on Sunday morning, 5 o'clock on Sunday night, and 6 o'clock on Wednesday night. And so if you're in the area during one of those times, you'll come by and see us. We would love to talk with you, love to worship with you, and to fellowship with you as well. Speaking of fellowship, we have a fellowship meal coming up this Sunday night. And so if there's any time to come visit, you should come eat with us as well. I know we'll have some good food there, and we'll have a good time. And so we're at a fellowship meal this Sunday night. And so always be aware of that if you're in the area. Also, if you have any questions or comments, please feel free to send those our way. We'd love to hear what you would like to hear, and what you think of the study, that we do. And so, that's available, to you as well. But for here tonight, we're going to take a look at John chapter 9. John chapter 9. As you know, the book of John, the Gospel of John, is a pretty interesting book. It's something that's loaded towards the back part of Jesus' ministry. Matthew deals with a lot of the beginning part. John deals with mostly the latter part, and so he records a lot of different scenes that some of what we usually call the synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, that they don't record. And so John has a different perspective of things that he chooses to include in his gospel story. One of those here is found in John chapter 9. As we know, Jesus, he was a healer. He was someone who always had the ability not only to free us from sin, but also to free us from physical ailments, as he would do many times throughout his ministry. So he's going to do that one more time here in an interesting story where he encounters a man who is blind from birth. Before we get started, we want to say hello to Jackie Henry. Hope that you are doing well. Hope that you have had a pleasant day. Really appreciate you being here with us tonight. It's always good to see you. But in verse 1, verse 1 and 2 here of John chapter 9, this is how he begins this chapter. As he passed by, he saw a man blind from birth, and his disciples asked him, "Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind?" And so Jesus is traveling, and he is on the road, and they pass by this man who had been blind from birth. This man wasn't injured in an accident. He wasn't, someone who was recently thrown into this condition, but this man had been blind from birth. He had never seen a single thing in his life, because he had suffered this, from ever since he was born. And so, likely from a birth defect, he was dealing with this condition, and he had no choice but to depend upon the charity of others in order for him to survive, or for him just to get by. And so that is what he does. But he is there, and the disciples, pass by him along with Jesus. And the disciples have an interesting question that they pose, to Jesus. A very kind of heavy theological question that they throw at Jesus, here. And so they see this man, and this is not going to be a question of how can we help this man or what can we learn from this man. But the question they asked him in verse 2, it says, "And his disciples asked him, 'Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind?'" Now, as you know, this was a common belief, during this time, that a person's physical, well-being was kind of tied, directly, to their their spiritual well-being was tied directly to their physical, nature. And so they had this this theory, that this man had done something incredibly awful, incredibly wrong, and the consequences of such were so that he was dealing with this this condition. And which is kind of an odd question, because if the disciples knew that he was a man blind from birth, and we don't know if they knew that, we just knew that he was blind, but they asked him, who sinned, this man or his parents? Now, if he was going to be the one who sinned, then he would have had to do that before he was born, basically. And while there's a very, very, very small group of people that believe that you could sin while you were in the womb. I don't know how they justified that or what they brought about in order to believe that. But it was a very, very small group. But that may have been what influenced, this question. But they asked, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? A common, and like I said, this is not something that's isolated to this story, but this is a common conclusion that people make when they see somebody suffering in the Bible. You go all the way back to Job, a scene in which takes place thousands of years before the Gospels. And what was the conclusion of Job's friends when he came there? When they came and they saw his suffering, when they saw the anguish that he was in and all that he had lost and how far he had fallen from the great man that he was, what was their conclusion? Job, you need to repent. You need, to get your life right, because you have done something incredibly awful, incredibly bad in order to suffer, this calamity that you have done. They tied his physical success, to his spirituality, and said, the only reason why you would be suffering is because you deserved it. You did something incredibly wrong, and so you deserve what you're going through. But do we always deserve the suffering that we go through? Do people always deserve the suffering that they go through? I believe that answer to that is a resounding no. Sometimes we go through things, sometimes we suffer things that are a product of this world. Either they're the misdeeds of others, they're the mistakes of others, or they're just the imperfect nature of this world at work. And we have to suffer because of those things. As the case was with this man. He was born blind. He didn't have an opportunity in order to make a mistake such as this. And but he was still suffering. And no doubt some very, very good people. You may know some fantastic people out there who have suffered maybe quite a bit, either through illness or either through loss or through hardship. However that suffering may manifest itself, you probably know some very good people who have gone through these things. And it's a part of life. It's part of that, the kind of that hard nature of life, that we have. It's one of the things that makes it look makes it looking towards the future, looking towards that promise that God has given us, so inviting. Because we know we can put the suffering, we can put that, hardship, behind us, and we won't have to deal with it, no more. But they ask him, who sinned this man or his parents that he was born, blind? And so they give Jesus, two options. They say, did this man sin or his parents sin? And obviously, if he was born blind, then he didn't have an opportunity, to sin, even though that was the prevailing theory, at that time. And it was one reason why the Pharisees and some of the Sadducees would not have anything to do with like those who were blind or those who were lame or those who suffered from those conditions, because it was automatically assumed sometimes that they were sinners. They did something to deserve that, and so Pharisees didn't want to have anything to do with it, which was a misstep on their part. But he tells them, and he goes through this this process, and to let them know just what is going on here. If you notice, the disciples who refer to him as rabbi, which means teacher, it's a respectful way to say teacher in that culture, and so they asked him, whether this man was sinned or his parents, and so the only other possible theory, if you're kind of following the disciples' logic here, is that his parents were the one who sinned. Like the parents did something incredibly wrong, and the consequences of that sin, was that their child was born in this way. And there was a notable Pharisee, I believe his name was Ami or something similar to that. And this is what he taught. He said there's no suffering without sin. He said suffering is inexplicably tied, to sin. And so that one of the things that several people believed, during this time, was the fact that sins could be passed down through generations, through the genetics, through the children that people had. If somebody was a horrible person, a horrible sinner, and they had a child, they would kind of pass that sin on to that child. And that's how we get things such as infant baptism, where babies are baptized or they're consecrated in some way, because just in case they do have sins inherited from their parents, they can be cleansed from that. But as we know, that's not something that the Bible supports. It's not something that the Bible teaches. But the Bible tells us that every man will stand before the judgment seat of Christ, 2 Corinthians, and to give an account of what he has done in the body, whether good or evil. And so we are going to be responsible for what we do, the choices that we make, the things that we choose to pursue in this life. It's not going to be because of our parents. It's not going to be because of our preacher. It's not going to be because of any influential person that has, influenced our life. But it's going to go down to one simple thing. What did we choose to do? Were we obedient to what Christ called us to do? Or did we reject that call and decide to go our own way? The choice is ours to make, and ours alone. No one can make it for us, but we are going to only be responsible for what we choose to do. Now, we know that there's a lot of people who can influence us and encourage us. And I've said many times before, I would not be where I am today without the influence and encouragement of others who pushed me forward and told me to keep on going and to keep pursuing the things that I was going after. And we all have those people who support us and encourage us. And they influence us, and that's a great thing. But we always have to be someone who's willing to take ownership and to take responsibility for our own faith. Like my parents were very influential in my life, and I have no doubt yours may have been as well. But still, their faith It's not your faith. And as we know, you're going to have to be someone who stands before God and to give an account of what you have chosen to do. And so sin is not passed down from parent, to children. And as we know, sometimes the consequences of actions can follow through, to their children. Sometimes children suffer, from what their parents do or what they choose to do, during their time. We see that a lot, with addiction. We see that a lot, with, some poor choices that are made, by parents when the children are very young. And so you can see that happen sometimes. They can suffer from the consequences of that sin. But as far as their soul is concerned, as far as the pure innocent nature of a child, they do not have any sin whatsoever. They are innocent and they are right before God. It's only when we have that opportunity to make our own choices does that responsibility come upon us. And so they asked this question, who sinned, this man or his parents? They was born blind. And just like Jesus often does, as we know, this is not the first time, not the only time that Jesus does this, but he's asked a question. He's given, two answers. Is it this man or is it, the other man? Or is it this man or his parents? And Jesus says, neither. In verse 3, he says, Jesus answered, it was not that this man sinned or his parents, but that the works of God might be displayed in him. We must work the works of him who sent me. While it is day, night is coming, when no one can work. And as long as I am in the world, I am the light of the world. And so Jesus, is going to answer. He's saying, they give him these two choices, but he says it was not this man sinned or his parents. So it's not the result of this man's actions, it's not the result of his parents' actions, but that the works of God might be displayed in him. Now that can be a tough thing, to think about. Can the works of God be displayed in our suffering? That's always a hard thing, to talk about. It's always a hard thing to note, because I know there is people out there in the world who have suffered, much more than I have, who have suffered, more than me. And so it's difficult, to say this, without, being able to walk in everybody's, shoes. As you know, no one knows what you have gone through but you know yourself. But sometimes the works of God can be displayed in our suffering, in the hard things that we go through, and we can sometimes see him the clearest, see him with the most focus when we are struggling and when we're going through those tough things, because sometimes we become more reliant on the grace of God. We become more reliant on his power, and that causes us to see the works that he is doing within us. We know that no suffering is good in of itself. We don't want to see anyone suffer. If we can do what we can to alleviate suffering of somebody, then we're going to do that. We want to do that as quickly as possible. But the works of God can be seen sometimes in suffering. James talks about how suffering produces patience. It produces endurance. And that endurance produces other things, and in the end, that draws us closer to God. And so John is recording the words of Jesus here, and Jesus says it's not this man, it's not his parents, but so that the works of God might be displayed in him. And then verse 4 he says, we must work the works of him who sent me while it is day. Night is coming when no one can work. As long as I am in the world, I am the light of the world. A famous quote that Jesus said, I am the light of the world. It's not the only portion in the Bible where he says this, but he says we must work now. We must work while there is day, because when the sun goes down, when the night is coming, when no one can work. But he says, as long as I'm here, as long as I'm walking on this earth, He says, I am the light of the world. I'm the one who brings light to the darkness. I'm the one who brings light, to the people. That's who I am. That's who Jesus is. He is a light in a world of darkness. And as you know, sometimes if you have even just a little bit of light in a room of complete darkness, you can see it, and it affects your vision. And so, in a world that sometimes you're pretty dark, what do we have to be? We need to follow the example of Jesus and be that light of the world as well, as he tells us in Matthew chapter 5, to be the light of the world. A city set up on a hill cannot be hidden. But to be that light and to make sure that people know that there is hope, that there is a God who cares for them, a God who loves them, a God who wants to bring them in. That is something that we have to be. We have to be that beacon, that lighthouse that can lead people to shore and let them come to experience what Jesus knows. He says, I am the light of the world. But then in verse 6, he turns his attention back to the blind man. He says, having said these things, he spit on the ground and made mud with his saliva. And then he anointed the man's eyes with mud and said to him, go wash in the pool of Siloam, which means sent. And so he went and washed and came back seeing. And so Jesus turns back to this man, and in probably one of the most unusual cases of Jesus healing somebody in the Bible. He takes, he spits on the ground, he makes mud with the saliva, and then he puts that mud on the man's eyes, and he tells him to go to a specific place and wash. And the man does, and he comes back with his sight restored. I mean, can you imagine what that must have been like? Somebody who had never seen a single thing in their entire life washes the mud from their eyes, and they're able to see. They're finally able to see what the world around them looks like. What an experience, that would be. But Jesus, uses this very unusual method in order to heal this man, and indeed he is healed. Something that was far beyond any of the doctors, any of the physicians of that time. They didn't know how to do this. They couldn't solve and bring this man's sight back to him. But Jesus could, because his power is greater than anything in this world. And could Jesus have just said, your sight is restored? Maybe so. We don't know why he did this. He went through this process, but Jesus, who has a whole lot more wisdom than I do, we knew what he was doing. And this man, who was the subject of this theological question that the disciples threw at Jesus, is now someone who can see. And this is a brand new life for him. Now, he can go and he can get a job. He can, pursue goals. He can support himself. He can, he can worship in the temple. He can do so many things that he was prevented from doing, before, all because Jesus, washed his eyes. He was able to see. How wonderful a thing it is that Jesus can open our eyes so that we, can see. Because a lot of times, there are people in this world who can see physically, but a lot of times they don't see what God is doing. They don't see the extension of grace that Jesus, offers us. And they go about, missing something that is right, in front of them. But Jesus can give us the sight of what is truly important. And that's a wonderful thing, to know. And because, this man is going to go through a process after this. I mean, you can imagine what he was feeling at during this time, but there is going to be a saga. We don't have time to go through all of this here tonight. But from verses, all the way from verses, 8 down to the end of the chapter, I think. Yeah, to the end of the chapter, this man is going to be interrogated. He's going to be brought before the Pharisees, and they're going to question him. They're not going to believe what he says. They eventually throw him out of the synagogue, and all because of Jesus. And it's quite an ordeal that follows this. But his eyes were open, and they weren't just open physically, but he recognized who Jesus was, and he worshipped him. And if we're someone who follows, that example, when if we truly realize who Jesus is, what's going to be our response? We're going, to worship him, because we know that there is nothing like him in all of this world. He provides something for us that you can't get anywhere else, and that's salvation and an eternity with him. And that's a fantastic thing to look forward to. But I think that's where we will stop, right there. And I believe next week we will finish out, this chapter and look at the story that follows this, healing. And because I always find this a fascinating chapter, and so hopefully, you do as well. But like I said, we will be back here next week, for another episode. I'm working on some guests to join us, for this study in the future, and so hopefully you can join in then when they arrive. And so we'll be back here, I said, next Thursday at 7:00. And so I guess until next time, until we meet again, hope that you have a wonderful rest of your day. How you can go out and glorify God in everything that you do. Catch you next time.